And questions. I also thank all the participants from the audience side. Thank you very much.
Of the day, Mritunjoy Mohanty of the Indian Institute of Management, the speaker, Mr. Navin Verma, Secretary Industries Department, Government of Bihar, the chair. Mr. Verma, please.
Thank you, sir. Sorry, I myself got a bit late. But it's a privilege to introduce our guest speaker today. It's my privilege to introduce the guest speaker for today's session. Can you hear me? Yeah. Good evening to all of you. I hope this time it's audible. It is. Yeah. It's my privilege to introduce our guest speaker for today's session, Professor Mritunjoy Mohanty. He teaches economics at IIM Kolkata. His research interest includes open economy, macroeconomics, growth and structural change, political economy of growth and development, international trade, financial markets, and so on and so on. I suppose there are many others. He holds a PhD from the JNU, New Delhi. And today he is speaking on growth and institutional evolution in India, a political economy view. So I think without much ado, we shall give the floor to you, Professor Mohanty.
Thank you, Mr. Verma, for the kind introduction, and sorry to impose this lecture on political economy at the end of a very long day. I hope I won't take more than my allotted time, and I hope this will be of some interest. The area of political economy is, of course, something that everybody has a view on, as they ought. And so I'll urge your indulgence to look at what I'm presenting, even though it might be in part somewhat counterintuitive. And then maybe if there is sufficient interest, go to questions. Now, this is a part of a much larger project that I'm currently engaged in, which is tracking the change of growth trajectories in India. So one thing about the tracking of growth trajectories in India, that you must answer political economy questions. Otherwise, there is little point in addressing some things where you don't understand the turning points and what shapes what. Right? So this is a part of that project. The preview of the paper is this. The aim of the paper is to explore how institutional evolution has been both intentional as the result of policy reform and unintentional and unanticipated as the result of contestation, structural features, and the conjuncture, and how this may shape future growth trajectories. So where do I locate the political economy for India? I locate the political economy of India in India's constitution. And India's constitution has both radical and conservative elements. And the point I'm trying to make, and this is the central theme of this paper, which is forces of contestation shape what prevails at which point of time, right? Now, most of you who know this will know the fact that, you know, in our constitution we got affirmative action, we got land reforms and so on and so forth. What is less understood is the fact that it left India's elite, our independence movement left India's elite almost completely unchanged. And that unchanging nature of the elite came to exercise a huge influence on what was the outcome of the struggle between the radical and the conservative forces. Now, agrarian India, particularly, remember our independence, India is almost entirely agrarian. About 60% of the output is from agriculture, about 80% of labor is from in agriculture. In agrarian India is the source of what we call the most conservative elements. And it was very successfully able to resist the radical tendencies of the constitution. Right? So, and for almost 30 years, 35 years, the elite was able to ensure the fact that the radical agenda of the Indian constitution was not implemented by entirely controlling its implementation. Yeah, so the standard argument, for example, land reform, which is one of the best examples of it, gets stuck in the judiciary. Yes, and the only places that you have land reform is where there is contestation from below to force land reform on the agenda and keep it there. Otherwise, it gets caught and gets obfuscated and obstructed. Now, having said that, I should also say that this way of posing the question as in the constitution having contradictory elements, and the forward movement being shaped by these contradictory elements, is not mine alone. Yeah? In a very different fashion, Khilnani has the same view. Sunil Khilnani's view of India as an idea, the idea of India, says almost exactly the same thing. Of course, he says it's better because he writes better. Yeah? But the notion that the foundational bedrock of which the idea rested was the recognition of the primacy of politics. Right? First, the decision taken by the national elites, which come into possession of the independent Indian state 47, was to commit the state to the pursuit of multiple goals. Yes, the multiplicity of goals comes from the fact that contradictions are inherent in the Indian constitution. They also refuse the argument that wanted to sequence these goals, the goals of economic development, political democracy, and so on and so forth. Indian leadership chose to pursue several goals simultaneously: democracy, economic development, and the measure of social justice. Now, the notion of Khilnani has that in India, democracy is special is something I agree with. I agree with because the framers of India's constitution gave democracy to a people which is completely illiterate, almost completely illiterate, and gave political freedom in that democracy. There's stuff I disagree with, but I think it is special in that fact. And I think what Khilnani highlights is the fact that the primacy of politics is inherent in the Indian constitution. What is interesting is that once you come into the reform period from about 1991, the primacy of economics is supposed to supersede the primacy of politics, because it says there are certain economic arguments which drive a certain kind of economic strategy. My argument today is that perhaps we are coming back to a situation where the primacy of politics will finally emerge again. He then goes on to say something very interesting, which is that he outlines two cases, and in the third possibility, as an encounter that alters both protagonists, a process of agonistic refinement that produces an ever more abundant diversity, always more inclusive and complex. Now, the key over there is diversity, complexity, and inclusiveness, right? But affirm that it was more important to recognize the plurality of values and to commit the state to this plural vision. This, of course, is Khilnani's central point. India is a political idea, and the political idea is one of inclusiveness, right? My differences with Khilnani come that it was not India's elite that chose this. It is what is forced in the elite by movements, radical movements around land and caste that were part of the independence movement, right? Second, in Khilnani, the outcome is, he says, is inclusive and diverse. I impose no requirement of such outcome on mine. It can be, therefore, sometimes lead to consequences that are unanticipated but may yet shape long-term trajectories. Decisions may be reached by democratic means, but may not produce results that are ever more abundant diversity, always more inclusive and complex. Right? Now, I'm going to talk almost entirely about the post-reform period, not looking at the earlier period, but obviously in this political economy, well, has to go back and be able to look at that. Just to give you a very short kind of, whichever way you wanted to spin this, whichever way you want to spin it, in terms of per capita income, India has seen unprecedented growth from the 1990s onwards. Just before you get chuffed about it, just to compare with China, to remind that the Chinese have done infinitely better. Also notice the fact that in the 1980s, India was slightly higher than Chinese. And when you look at the numbers, India was about 430 per capita in 1980, is 4,000, 10 times purchasing power parity. China has gone from about 250 to 10,000, so that's the relative. But nonetheless, surely incomes have increased. Surely incomes have increased, and there are no two ways about this. It's increased across all regions, and one has to recognize that. Second, this increase in incomes has come on the back of increase in saving and investment. Your standard growth macroeconomics tells you that you need a certain level of saving and investment to be able to get into self-sustained growth. Once upon a time when Rostow wrote his anti-communist or non-communist manifesto, he had put it at 20%, but today in today's world it's probably 35–40%. And we seem to have arrived there, right? Look, compare. The only thing to compare is, in 1980, China is saving at 35%. It's investing at 35%. So when you look at the levels of saving and investment, it is not rocket science that China has done better than us. All right? We have just arrived there. But if we place that precondition of 35–40, then in a macroeconomic growth sense, we perhaps have come to the point where it's sustainable in terms of higher levels of per capita income. This has happened alongside a very significant process of integration into the global economy. So from the 70s, total trade, goods and services included, was about 10%. It's sitting at 48%. If I take you a little further on, it actually goes to 50%. So in 93, with the beginning of reform, we had about 20% of the economy is integrated into the global market. Today, it's 52%. All right? The government of India, of course, would like to tell you that a lot of it has to do with gold and silver. So look at the second column, which gives you non-oil, non-gold, silver integration. Yeah? That's also substantial. It's more than doubled. Right? Also notice the fact that the non-oil import ratio is higher than the non-oil export ratio. So your import integration minus oil, gold, and silver has been faster and greater than export integration. Whichever way we want to spin this, the increase in incomes has happened alongside integration, asymmetric integration perhaps, but substantial integration. But, there's always a but, isn't there? You look at the share of manufacturing. 1980, India is pursuing imports substituting industrialization. 1992, you change track, you integrate into global markets and so on and so forth. But whatever you do with India, integrate, don't integrate, manufacturing doesn't budge. Over a 35-year period, the share of manufacturing fluctuates between 14 to 16%. All right? And manufacturing, mind you, is India's most integrated sector. Currently, X plus M in manufacturing GDP is about 160%. Manufacturing is India's most integrated sector, yet it does nothing. So this is your new Hindu rate of growth. That which doesn't budge. Do what you will with it. Before I go on, there is one other problem which we'll come back to later. The integration itself has come along with a current account deficit. Again, the government of India will tell you the current account deficit is because we import oil, which is true, and it's gone up in value. And of course, Indians love gold. And because Indians love gold, that's the reason you're on a current account deficit. But the problem with that argument is the fact that you have a very high level of integration in manufactured imports. Yeah? And some part of the current account deficit actually reflects a technology deficit. So one of the things that you had hoped for in reform is to get technology, something that hasn't happened. All right? Any case. Now, alongside this process of integration, has been a process of elite restructuring, democracy, and progressive legislation. I'll not go into elite restructuring just now. If there's time in the end, I perhaps will. But one of the unintended consequences of this integration was financial market reform, which almost directly led to an agrarian crisis. The agrarian crisis was a way in which you took farmers out of the elite and imposed almost an entirely an urban-centric view of the world. But having said that, look at that list of legislation. There is devolution, there is the Rural Employment Guarantee Act, there is the Right to Information, there is affirmative action, there is Unorganized Workers Social Security Act, there is the FRA, there is the New Land Act. All right? So there are two things that happen simultaneously almost. On the one hand is an integration into the global economy. On the other hand is legislation that looks that reduces the space of the state to act in favor of capital. Now standard analysis and standard reportage treats this as the giveaway, the SOPs. So the government is growing, it needs to pacify all these characters, so these are the SOPs that it gives. In my analysis, these are all outcomes of contestation. And if they are outcomes of contestation, you're not going to be able to reverse them as easily as you might want to. All right? So they're there, then they shape outcomes. So we look at intended reform. In terms of intended reform, of course, is globalization and integration. And it was clearly intended to integrate. And we've seen that this has happened. There is one issue, which is that of current account crisis. Just to give you one sense of how this current account crisis plays out in terms of technology. One of the fastest growing sectors of the Indian economy in the last 20 years has been telecom services. Now, telecom services, well, has cell phones and has telecom equipment. So now, the firm with the second largest market share in India is Micromax. Yeah? And guess where Micromax makes its phones? As it happens, they're all made by Honhai. And who's Honhai? Honhai is the original equipment manufacturer for Apple. You know it perhaps at Foxconn. So value added in cell phone, 0. So you go back down the way into telecom equipment. So where do we buy your telecom equipment from? Huawei, right? Ericsson. So the fastest growing sector of the economy has almost zilch value added. Now, which is one of the best firms in telecom? Bharti, right? Great brand value, right? Guess who handles the back end of Bharti? IBM. So what did you get out of it? Bharti got lots of money. Micromax made lots of money, and that's the only plus in this, that an Indian firm makes profits. And you mustn't run down that fact, because without any profits, you can't grow. Well, where is the value added? Practically negligible. So that's the technology question. So my question, which I'm not answering today, which I hope to be able to give some answer, why does Indian private corporate capital not like to learn? As any economist will tell you, growth is all about learning and capabilities. So why does Indian private capital not like to learn? Leave the Tatas out. Why does ISRO learn? Why does Micromax not learn? But we're not getting into that. The second area which was intended is labor market reform. Now, labor market reform is more de facto than de jure. You haven't touched labor markets in a long time, but what you have done is moved the state to act in favor of capital. in no uncertain terms. How have you done it? You've stopped recognizing new unions. The entire Maruti thing centered around the fact that Maruti would not recognize the union. When it went to arbitration and the government of Haryana, the Labour Court gave a decision to recognize, still didn't recognize. So you've moved, you've promised capital that it's not going to face labor trouble. One of the ways of doing it is you are not going to register new unions. Second, when you go into labor court, most of the decisions go in favor of capital. Now, these are all listed. This is not a matter of dispute. Well, you might think that's a good thing or a bad thing. That's not the point. The point is, between state and so between capital and labor, state tilted towards towards capital, with de facto change in labor markets, right? There is still some nuance in this. What is interesting, for example, in Tamil Nadu, construction labor has been able to work out an equation with the state where they're guaranteed a certain level of social security. Now that adds nuance to the overall story where you move towards, where state has moved towards capital. Now, what is unintended evolution? First and foremost is the Forest Rights Act. Now, the Forest Rights Act started out life as a standard issue property rights act. You wanted property rights defined over forests because the assumption is, the neoliberal assumption is, the fact that once you can define property rights, you can do other things, market exchange can take place, people will gain, and so on and so forth. Now, what started out as a standard issue property rights through a process of contestation, division, deliberation, finally ended up as one of the most radical pieces of legislation that India has enacted in a long, long time. What's radical? What's radical is forest dwellers, for the first time, have been recognized as having use rights. All right? Now, for a long time, the Forest Rights Act gets passed. Remember Niyamgiri. Now, in Niyamgiri, that battle has gone on for 10 years. In the first instance, courts said if the state has said public purpose, it must mean public purpose. So nothing moved. Until it came to defining what consultation was. Finally, the Supreme Court said that consultation must also involve some degree of consent. Now, it was this which finally threw out Vedanta from Niyamgiri. Please remember, Vedanta accounts for 1/3 of the volume on the London Metal Exchange. It's one of the largest players in the international market, not as big as Rio Tinto and so on and so forth, but a very large player. Certainly one of the largest metal firms in India. So the reversing of Vedanta's acquisition of Niyamgiri is no small matter. Now, mind you, this is when there's the government of India machinery which still doesn't want to implement the FRA. All right? I'm not saying it's a battle that's over. I'm simply saying that there are consequences to having laws, and today it's much more difficult to supersede those laws using administrative or legal fiat. So what Niyamgiri proves to you is that a sustained campaign, which is democratic and non-violent, finally uses the FRA to reverse an acquisition that capital had made. The new land acquisition bill, one of the first things that India's capitalists have said, please reverse it. It's too much, it's too bad. Why is it too much? It raises the price of land. Should price of land go up? Of course it should go up. We are a land scarce country. Does the price of land hamper growth? Of course not, it doesn't hamper growth. There are any number of episodes of development where price of land has been high and yet growth happens. Yet, you might be pricing land properly by recognizing its scarcity. It happens. But of course, if land is the basic subsidy for capital, then hey, I want cheap land. Right? Third is the renaissance of the public sector. And this is a paper done by my colleague Sushil Khanna, is a 2011 version which is published, a more detailed version he's working on. And what he says is this: that today the public sector is actually very, very efficient. And we'll just see how. But why does it? So you have an agenda in the beginning of reform of privatization. That agenda gets stalled because there are a couple of high-profile privatizations which were seen to be underpriced. Then protest stalls it. Now, once it is stalled, then when the UPA comes, it uses disinvestment, right? Now, the interesting thing about it, that what happens is two things. First, price decontrol is moved off. Firms can set prices. Second, public sector is given managerial autonomy. Now, who drove the agenda to remove price decontrol? The private sector. The private sector said, you remove price decontrol, that's the cost of us getting into that sector. Who gained from it? The public sector. Because it is efficient. Right? Now look at this. Manufacturing capital firms, return on capital employed. Return on capital employed, the red is the public sector, the blue is the private sector. From somewhere around the late 90s, return on capital on public sector firms is consistently higher than private sector. All right? Now you break it up. You break it up, whether you want to do non-affiliated, you want to do affiliated, you want to do business groups, that red on top is still the public sector. So today, actually, the public sector is very, very efficient, makes tons of money. And the tons of money actually is used by the government of India, and when it asks it to do A, B, C, D. Right? Now this very bad, very, very bad thing, the only point I want to draw your attention to is that this efficiency of the public sector comes not from the fact that it can charge monopoly prices. It comes from the fact that it actually does things better. So NTPC per unit production of power in 2011 is 2.6. Tata Power in that same year is 4.8. And this is true for most public sector power generating units. So the argument that the public sector today makes profits because it's monopoly simply doesn't wash. It makes money because it is efficient. All right? And this is a completely unintended outcome of the reform process. All right? And today you can't wish it away. Today you daren't put Arun Shourie as the Minister of Disinvestment. Arun Shourie was the Minister of Disinvestment in the first NDA government. Then, having done all this, there are alternate models of growth. Okay, Dresden Sen. So Gujarat is your poster boy. The Gujarat is the poster boy of your globalization phase. Yeah? So let's look at that. So if you leave Uttarakhand out, Gujarat is among the highest, right? But compare the poverty. It has much higher levels of poverty. It's not just poverty. Look at life expectancy, look at non-literacy between 15 and 19. Look at maternal mortality, look at the sex ratio, any which way you spin the Gujarat model. Any which way you spin the Gujarat model, that model is an inferior model in terms of quality of life. All right? Now, why am I talking about Gujarat here? The fact that Tamil Nadu and Kerala give you a far greater, Tamil Nadu and Kerala give you far better outcomes for growth than Gujarat comes from the fact that they use a different development trajectory. It's a development trajectory where it is public service driven. Public investment in education, public investment in health, albeit using very different models. In Kerala, there is no accommodation with private capital. In Tamil Nadu, there's actually an engagement with private capital. All right, so you have a wage subsidy which is given to you have a wage subsidy that is given to private capital in terms of the fact that there is public delivery of education and health. The public delivery of education and health, both in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, I will submit, is the result of the fact of contestation. Everybody, of course, knows the fact of the importance of the Yidava movement in Kerala in shaping choices that Kerala makes. For the same kind of thing you get in Tamil Nadu, which is the DMK movement. I'm not praising the DMK movement in the fact of what it did to people or not. I'm simply saying it broke a very old hegemony. And breaking of that hegemony allowed for a public service-driven growth strategy. So when you compare Gujarat and when you compare Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, which is the more interesting comparison to make, but because both Gujarat and Tamil Nadu have serious manufacturing capital, and Kerala doesn't have manufacturing capital, and private manufacturing capital in both places, the difference is the fact that one is a public services-driven strategy and the other is a private capital-driven strategy. Right? So when I come back to it, the nature and process of contestation be central to defining growth strategies. And today, why is it that contestation mattered less in 1970s? It's not as if contestation wasn't there. There was very serious contestation. There was the Naxalbari movement, there was the JP movement. You can list movement after movement. Why is it that it is in a sense the deepening of India's democracy, not parliamentary democracy, but deepening of India's democracy where movements from below shape the parliamentary agenda. And having shaped the parliamentary agenda, they give you institutional evolution, which then you have to live with. Capital has to live with it. People have to live with it. Now, I'll finish with one observation. And the observation is this. So today you have an efficient public sector. But that efficient public sector is actually quite useless. Why? Because it lacks a strategic purpose. Now, when you had the public sector in the second five-year plan, it had a very clear strategic purpose. Today, they're very good people, making lots of money, shoring up the government's accounts, but not telling you where you might go. If it is the public sector, if India has to change path, and it is only the public sector that is going to, it is only the public sector that's going to make good the technology deficit, the learning deficit. If it is that, then it must regain that strategic vision with which it plays a role in, particularly in the growth of this nation. Thank you.
I said we are speechless now. So friends, we just had a very, I can say, a very passionate presentation on the contestations and how they have shaped the way we run our economy, and if I can say the polity. Well, I will use the chair's prerogative and I raise some questions before I pass on to my colleagues here. I had 2 or 3 questions, One was, what is the takeaway for us in Bihar from this entire presentation? You see, if you look at political economy, you also look at institutions which have worked in other states. If you look at a sub-national level, you talked about the national level. Well, I'll not go into that debate. Public sector, private sector. My friends in the industry will have a lot of views on that matter. How labor movements, labor laws, these are very complex issues. I would like to restrict myself to things which are on the sub-national level, if I can use that word. So, you started with the Constitution. I thought the 9th schedule gave the protection to the erstwhile landlord elites not to go to courts. When various states had the Land Reforms Acts, and Bihar also had one, the implementation was not because of any it was because, I would say, in my state, we were coping with the zamindari system and the permanent settlement of the British days. If you look at the British, how they ruled the country, they had 3 different systems. One was zamindari system. Is it a signal not to speak? I am just joking. No. I know, so I was wondering what I was speaking is. No, it's a conspiracy. No, what I was saying was that we had a permanent settlement in eastern India, so Bihar, Bengal, Odisha, Assam, where the British had a system where they had these zamindars, where they gave them a fixed tenure, and then they had sub-zamindars, and then sub-agents, and then sub-agents. That was totally different. In most parts of India, you had what is called the Rajpari system, where the state and the farmer had a direct nexus. Therefore, land reforms, there was not an issue at all. The problem of land reforms basically became an issue of this part of the state. Now, and yes, in my state, I do feel, yes, while we were among the first to reduce the Land Reforms Act, it was probably more on paper, because the elite, and that I agree with you, Professor Mohanty, that the elite may have felt that if it's actually implemented, then we lose everything. And that goes on even today. So while we have an Operation Bargadar in West Bengal, where what I call the subtenants, here we call the Bataidars. It is called Bataidars here, it's called Bagadars in Bengal. So the Bagadars have got rights there, here they don't have rights. Because my informal tendency, then when we tried doing that, whatever was the equilibrium was getting disturbed. So today, if I am a farmer, if I have land, I'm sitting in Patna, let me tell you, I don't have land, so I'm landless. So let me not see that I hold a brief for people who have land. Having said that, if I had land, and if I'm sitting in Patna, I will certainly like to see my land being tilled, and I get some money. The moment the person tills the land, gets some rights, I feel threatened. Now that I could be a politician, that I could be a bureaucrat, that I could be an academic, or a lawyer. And all these combined to make the elite. So it's basically a state issue. It's not a issue of constitution. So that is my first difference. The other issue on which I had certain things to say was about the example given about telecom. It is true that the expenditure on R&D in India is less compared to many other countries. And if you look at the private sector, it's even lesser. But that is how globalization works. In my view, globalization works when you maximize your competitive advantage. If it makes sense to produce semiconductor chips in in Taiwan, so be it. The entire world does that. And what do we gain? We gain by getting very cheap services. We do not have to gain by getting good value products. I'm told, I stand corrected, and I'm talking to an economist. I must confess I did economics in Delhi school. And I don't say that anymore, because after so many years in bureaucracy, we ceased to be economists. But what I was told was that the services, the telecom services, the rate at which I can make a call on my mobile is among the lowest in the world. So you can see, even in a state which is as poor as our state, we are among the poorest in the country, even the maid, the rickshawala, the daily wage laborer, the fellow who delivers, describe the Forest Rights Act and how the World Bank sort of thinking. I don't think so. I don't think that was ever the spirit. Well, the Forest Rights Act was always there. There was something called Forest Act. When I was in the field in 1988, 87 in Palamu, now a hotbed of Naxalites. That time it was very peaceful. Even in those days, we remember the forest people living in the forest areas, they had the right to usufruct. So they could actually collect twigs, they could get what is grown. The fight was between the fellows who were actually the loggers and the forest dwellers. And we had very overactive forest administrators who would actually, the lower bureaucracy will side with the contractors. And there were a lot of cases against the forest people. And that was one reason which was a cause of contention between the so-called sympathizers of Naxalites. Naxalism actually, if I can just digress, also dwells on perceived disaffection. So if I'm affected by an action of the state, by which I generally live in the forest, and if I'm collecting some twigs, which I have a right to collect, and there's some forest guard who files a case against me. So they have all sort of vague cases. And many states actually waived off such cases. And it was a natural outcome from those days to come to a place where people actually got a right to land. provided they were staying there. That's still going on. And I don't believe with this argument, being a bureaucrat myself, that the bureaucracy, whether in government of India or any state, works against an act. The one statement which you made, on which I have an objection, that the bureaucracy is trying to thwart the act. That is not correct. The bureaucracy, believe me, always implements. Whatever views we may have, we express before an act is framed. But once an act becomes, it becomes sacrosanct. And if we thwart it, the courts is not going to spare it. So that statement, those statements don't work. What works, and I can tell you my personal experience, what works is, and what is the problem is, because then you have a system of implementation. How do I know who is staying in which land since when? Suppose I go and say, look, I am staying in the forest land, these are my papers. I've never stayed there. So, and there is a chap who's actually staying for 35 years. Obviously, he gets the right, or he or she gets the right. But the fellow who's deciding who gets the right is the chap to be seen. So it's an issue of implementation. It's not an issue of intention not to implement. So anyway, I think I have used my veto power to say 3 questions. I'll stop here and now place the thing to the House. Thank you.
That's a political economy presentation. I have a bone to pick with you. Return on capital employed. There is a small subset of the public sector which overtly influences the overall sample. Right? So I would interpret your comment, if you have no objection, I have no question, to say that a smaller public sector, which is more focused on doing things that the private sector is unable to do, thereby releasing resources for the Indian private sector, would be the way forward, combined with a better appreciation of the public returns to investments in the sort of, I'm using the phrase like big data, big technology that the private sector in India is yet incapable of bringing to the service of the country. Good example of that would be, now that the Prime Minister said it, I can, defense. We need indigenous capacity in defense. FDI will probably not do the job on its own. We will need to have a substantial public sector producing defense equipment. Would that be something you would agree with? A smaller public sector, more focused, and focused on the public good things that you very rightly point out, combined with the private sector that is producing a rate of return on capital employed that is not as bad as your graph.
Well, it's shields that I'm using, and I own it. Yes, please.
Just only one point to offer. The manufacturing, you said, has been stagnant for almost all these years. And what has been the reason? Initially, all the manufacturing which started was the public sector alone. The others were not allowed to come except for Tata's, which you said, mentioned it also. Otherwise, in the overall context, manufacturing stayed where it is because of the various environmental realities which are prevailing in our country, and it has remained as it is as of today. And there is a need to grow. So that is one point which I said. The second point which you mentioned, because both are correlated, that the public sector, you said, that is earning and the growth is there. Now when you compare public sector really, and you number them in the whole country, whether large or small, everything is public sector, out of which you can just take out 10 of them and give them this data to say that they have earned so much and given it to the government. But when you realize the infrastructure which they have been provided free of cost over the years, and then you see the cost which they bring out. If a public sector was supposed to give 50,000 crores of money, it gives 5,000 crores and the government is very happy because it is showing in positive. It's not red. What happens to them? Where if it was with another agency, it could have given at least 30,000 crores. Whether how you manage that, does it come to the government's use, does it come to the personal's use, that's a separate issue to discuss. So therefore, when we just say 10 odd public sectors giving us all the positive factors, in that case there is no point for the private sector to come up this way. that may be questionable because it is not the same land or same playing field which is made available. The land which has been made available to the public sector, free of cost for over the years, is tremendous. And all the other infrastructure which is made available to them, the people who are coming from various departments to work there are being paid from by various channels which are not counted in that. So therefore, when we consider this aspect, we got to look into this matter. And I wanted you to clarify to me the issue of the manufacturing sector remaining stagnant and the public sector, right from 1947 onwards, has been given a place of pride in our country, and they have developed to a situation. So that is one point I would like you to clarify to us. And the second issue, which just now was brought out about the defense. Yes, we would like to have own private sector or the government Indian sector coming into defense and not from outside. But then we have to understand that we have to grow to that, to bring up to a standard the foreign investment coming into that so that you are able to meet the requirement. If you are not able to meet the requirement, the defense sector, how it works, what is required for after 15 years has to start working now. So in these 15 years, you can't be unprepared. So you got to have certain things which have to come from outside, and there are three ways, three channels as to how it must go. So therefore, we must strive to get our own industry giving us full defense equipment, but you have to have incentive coming from outside to give you till that backup is made, because in defense you cannot wait for 20 years for your equipment to come in. So this point needs to be thought of, and we should strive for complete, we should be dependent on our own country, provided we are able to meet the security requirement for that period till you are able to do that. That's all. Thank you.
Well, I'll give you the mic. I've been asked to request you to please restrict yourself to only one question and make a brief intervention. Consider the fact that people have been here since morning. I have not been. I just got up after a nice siesta, so I have no issue. Others have. So the request, please go ahead, make some simple intervention and one question. Yeah.
What's your view on efficiency of air-in? Right from the day of Tata days to this one. And what is the status of IDPS, the service units in private?
So my question, I'm Gopal Krishna, I am an independent researcher. This is focused on the title itself of your presentation, is Growth and Institutional Evolution. I wanted to take a minute to introduce two texts of the World Bank, a 1997 text and a 2006 text, which deals with institutions as an intangible capital. And it commits an epistemic sin by comparing natural capital with institutional capital. Here, when you are using the term growth and institutional evolution, there definitely growth is for wealth creation, which is a different category in itself, and institutional evolution is a different category. Both are different epistemes. We keep saying we cannot compare apples and oranges, but the World Bank says, two reports. One, in 1997 it said, a report titled Expanding the Measure of Wealth, and second, where is the wealth of nations? So what I got a sense from your presentation was that the elite which you referred to is hiding behind institutional wealth to protect its hereditary benefits for a long, long time. By creating this institutional wealth, which the contesting parties are not able to pierce through, and sometimes they pierce through. And lastly, because some questions have been raised, I want to ask your comments on the failure of the Kingfisher, or the performance of the Kingfisher Airlines as well. Thank you.
Is this on? Yes? No, so let me just, there's almost like 8 things I noted, but I'll stick myself to 3. Let me start by saying the one thing I agree with you, and then there's stuff that I find questionable, and then there's stuff that I find downright misguided, and then potentially dangerous, okay, in what you just said. So I think, so the part I agree with the fact that this the elites at various points have kind of blocked the implementation of anti-poverty programs, distributive policies, whether it's land reform, whether it's NREGS, whether it's, ample work that demonstrates very clearly that local elites kind of resist that reduces their bargaining power. Okay, so that much. Sorry. Right. Okay, so there's ample evidence on that. So that I think I agree with you completely, right? And that you have to fight for your rights. That being said, so then let me move to the part that I think is kind of problematic. So it's about claiming public sector is more efficient, and this is not about monopolies. You absolutely cannot be claiming that based on that one picture you showed, right? So if you want to make that argument convincing, you have to look at it sector by sector, holding the level of competition constant. If you have India there, ONGC there, I don't care what you say, the returns you're picking up are the monopoly rents. I know you said that's not the case, but I can't believe that from the figure till you show this to me sector by sector by sector. Okay, so that's just not tenable if you don't show the graph the right way. I think then the part that's kind of in terms of claiming that somehow if the contract is given to IBM, right, that is somehow bad. I think, where is IBM employing these fellows? Those chaps are all employed right here in India. Okay, so what we've known about FDI is the misguided thinking of FDI, the foreigners are getting the profits. But what we've learned over time is most of technology spillovers happen from the intangible learnings that the employees in these companies get. So if you look at the entire outsourcing industry in India, it owes to Jack Welch deciding for GE to come and set up its first call centers here in India. So people worked over there, learned how to do this stuff, and then went on to set up their own startups, which then employed hundreds of thousands of people. So I think fact that the contract notionally goes to a foreign company, is kind of literally the 70s thinking, that got us to throw out IBM and Coke, and I think it's completely invalidated by the data, and it's almost dangerous to somehow go back to this notion, that we need a strong public sector to take care of these programs, because, so let me just end up with one final note on Air India. It's absurd that a country like Singapore, that has 1/40th or 1/50th the population and no history speak of, gets more tourists in a year than all of India. That has one of the oldest civilizations in the world. And the single biggest driver of this is Singapore's open skies policy. So in trying to protect Air India, we've killed the tourism industry, by kind of still negotiating on bilaterals, and restricting access into the country. So here you have Singapore, that has open skies and gets more tourists than all of India. So, the point of basic market economics, now I completely agree with you that we need to do more on anti-poverty programs. The problem is the anti-poverty programs are designed so horribly. So, and we pour money down a funnel that is a broken system in terms of delivery. So Tamil Nadu, so to come and say if Bihar could be like Tamil Nadu, we would be better. It's like saying, if my uncle was a woman, she'd be my aunt. Tamil Nadu is a different universe, okay, in so many different ways. So, some of the results we'll present tomorrow on PDS, for example. It's not just the leakage levels, but when you offer cash transfers, 80% of beneficiaries choose to exchange their food coupons for an equivalent amount of cash. So I think what is, I think, important is to separate the do-good instinct, from the design of how you do this. And I absolutely agree with you, that elites have stymied anti-poverty programs. That's the timer. Perfect. So, yeah, perfect, right? So, yeah, so I think we need soft hearts but hard heads. And unfortunately, soft hearts often go with soft heads in this country.
Okay, thank you. From the left side, I can't be rightist now. No questions on the side?
No, we got a few questions.
No more. No more questions. Okay. Anybody else? Sure, sir. Oh, he's saying no. Are you? Oh, he's signaling no more questions. Sir, are you? If there are no more questions, we shall ask.
How much time do you Another half an hour, you have to respond to all of this.
and I'm sure you don't want me to go on for half an hour. First, let me say, it's not a good way to end to say that soft hearts go to soft heads. That's not nice. Huh? Huh? You have a view of the world, and I have a view of the world. You will disagree with me, that's fine. That's Harvard. Yes? So if you have to debate, the moment you've gotten angry, you lost that debate. Second, I have not taken positions. I have merely said what outcomes are. All right? And the point I'm making is that these outcomes have been shaped by a certain process which makes those outcomes unintended. That is, that you have a reform process which has a certain notion of what the institutional basis of growth has to be. And you end up with institutions which are different from what had been envisaged had you implemented the reform process in toto. And you have to live with the fact of that change. Right? Now, I am not even for a moment saying that you go back to a public sector driven strategy. Not at all. I'm simply saying that it's very important to view all of this in clear, non-ideological terms. All right? I also take the point that when I take central public sector enterprises, its performance is dominated by a handful of firms. That is true. All right? But having said that, the fact that the others are allowed to survive doesn't necessarily mean that they're inefficient or that there are inefficiencies. All I'm saying is that you might need to think hard about, certain public sector firms that you need to wind up. For sure. I'm not in the business of saying that you bankroll firms just because they happen to be there. But what I'm also saying is that there is a BHEL. Today, BHEL is one of the world's most efficient producers of 500 megawatt turbines. You can't run away from that. The same BHEL, however, didn't make the transition to supercritical power plants. And that is the question. Why does a firm which is efficient in 500 megawatt turbine technology not make the transition to supercritical? Why is it the case that every supercritical turbine producer in India needs a JV? All right? The question of R&D. All right? Why I gave the example of ISRO is because ISRO is about capability. And the best example of ISRO's capability was that it had planned the Mars mission on a GSLV. The GSLV did not come up to scratch. It was on the third testing, it failed. Then it redesigned the launch of the Mars mission. It redesigned the launch to use the technology that it had, which it's mastered, which is the PSLV. It used the slingshot to get out of gravity. Now, a technologically capable entity is an entity that is able to change direction when it's needed to. That's learning. That's capability. To come to the chair's observation, sir, again, if I implied that there are no spin-offs from telecom, I take it back. That's certainly not my intention. Certainly, and again, I am not arguing that suddenly you should run away from outsourcing. You can't. It's simply impossible. When Barack Obama went to visit Steve Jobs, and he asked about outsourcing, and he said, "Can you change it?" Steve Jobs told him, "Sorry, this is one thing you can't change. It's here to stay, you live with it." And you live with it. But that's not the point I was taking. In terms of economic theory of growth, growth is not simply about producing things cheaply. At the end, growth is about value added. And value added is about technology and learning. No, for sure, the fact that India has the cheapest call rate in the world is an achievement not to sniff at. The fact that cell phone use is inclusive is one of the greatest achievements of this thing. But I'll draw your attention to two things. First, 10 years ago, India's call rates were very expensive. Very, very expensive. What happened? What happened is that policy which the UPA lost its shirt on. The first come, first served, increased competition in telecom. It brought in new players. It forced Airtel to reduce its call charges. So the fact that telecom charges came down is the result of efficient competition in the telecom industry, which is the result of first come, first served. Now the fact that Raja went and bribed is another matter. All right? I'm not saying that shenanigan didn't happen. All I'm saying is that policy was conceived of with the right spirit, and it yielded the results which had been designed to yield, which is reducing call charges. Right? So I'm not saying that, bureaucrats over here are here because they have a hand in their pocket all the time. All I'm saying is there are structural forces. And structural forces yield in certain moments of time and don't yield in others. And sir, to come back to the issue of land reform, actually, my knowledge of land reform and its impact comes from one of your predecessors. One gentleman by the name of P.S. Appu, who used to be a very senior, of course, civil servant, very well respected. At one point, he was the chair of the Lal Bahadur Shastri Academy, and perhaps has written one of the best analyses of land reform and its implementation till date. And it is his assessment that I reported. It is his assessment that I reported that land reform was thwarted in part due to bureaucracy and in part due to judiciary. Now, the process itself is different in different states. You're 100% right. There's no ways. And the land question itself is very different, as you very rightly pointed out. And one mustn't forget that. All I'm saying is there is contestation, and again I agree that usufruct rights in forest products has been long recognized, but to have it as a part of an act, which is then makes it constitutionally mandated, gives it a completely different status. Now, there are many questions to which I wish I had the time. First, let me say I'm really thankful because this is really work in progress. And I take everything back from here as I go forward into looking at this. But let me also say this, that I might have certain things that I'd like to happen. But one thing economics does teach you, and it's a good thing, is that it teaches you to be hard-headed. Okay? But like Ashok Mitra said, that economics teaches you how to ask the right questions, but very rarely gives you the tools to give you the right answers. Thank you.
That brings us all to the end of an engrossing day, another day.